over the course of this week, we've been talking a lot about income inequality, war making, how funds and policies in this country do not mirror the needs of the vast majority of the people in this country. They just don't. But just because that is the reality today does not mean that has to be the reality tomorrow. As Adrian and I mentioned in our discussion, there's some type of conditioning in this country that working class people are lulled into believing that the crumbs from the master's table is all that we can get. And in many cases, unfortunately, all that we deserve. But that is not true at all. And we have to do and demand a different thing and be willing to put some sweat equity on the change that we need to edify and to lift the greatest number of people in this country. It is tragic, morally, legally, politically, and socially tragic that in this hegemon nation, so few have so much and so many have so little. And to join me in digging down into this a little further, I have two of the greats. I have two of my dear friends, the director of Progressive Democrats of America, Alan Minsky, and Dr. Harvey J. Kaye, who's a professor emeritus of democracy and justice, the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. How are you both doing?
I'm doing fine, except for the weather outside.
I'm doing fine because of the weather outside. I'm from Southern California, so I'm loving the snow up here in upstate New York with my family.
Yeah, so glad you got a chance, Alan, to go and get a little of that snow. Snow is a beautiful thing, especially if it's not a storm and you don't have to drive in it. But Professor Harvey Kaye and I are in the Midwest, and we are expecting a heavy storm that's hitting places all across this country. So both of you, we've had many conversations about the 21st century economic bill of rights. But before we can go forward, I wanna go backwards. And so I'm gonna toss this question to Dr. Harvey Kaye in the house to talk to us about a time in this country where FDR did stand up, and that's President Franklin D. Roosevelt, just in case folks wanna know who in the hell is FDR. Yes, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt stood up to the forces and the big money interest of his day, and the American people were on his side. And that is the blueprint for the 21st century economic bill of rights. And Professor, please also talk to us about Asa Philip Randolph and all of his colleagues and allies who helped to shape the thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing to understand is that historians generally underestimate FDR from start to finish of his presidency for all of his faults and failings, and we can enumerate those on another occasion. The fact is that he was a social democrat and in many ways a radical. He wanted to overthrow, and he called on Americans to join him in overthrowing the persistent power structure, political and economic order of the late 19th century that was holding back America from the American promise. And in the course of the New Deal and then the war effort, Americans had developed such democratic energies that when he asked them in polls what it was they wanted after the war, the overwhelming majority, around 85%, made it clear they wanted national health care, what we would today call Medicare for all. They wanted a guarantee to a comfortable home. They wanted a job that paid a living wage. They wanted free, essentially, education as far as their abilities could take them. We could go on. The point is, he proposed in a State of the Union message in 1944, confident that Americans wanted this and that they were behind him. He called for an economic bill of rights. And the response was tremendous amongst working people. The major labor unions organized in the AFL and the CIO actually launched massive campaigns to get him reelected in order, hopefully, to secure that economic bill of rights. Unfortunately, though he was reelected, he died within a few months after the elections. And in the late 1940s, the reaction from big business and from the whole host of conservative and reactionary forces, including Southern white supremacists, blocked the advance of that economic bill of rights. But the project, the idea, was not lost. One of the most significant figures in labor and civil rights of the 30s and 40s Philip Randolph, Asa Philip Randolph, the leader, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the organizer of the March on Washington movement that began actually in 1941. He held on to that ideal. And in 1965, his institute, the Randolph Institute, released something called the Freedom Budget. It was a proposal to spend now it won't sound like very much, like, certain billion numbers of dollars in order to wipe out poverty in America, to eliminate freedom from want in America. And the entire proposal, which was endorsed by 150 leading figures in the United States, that proposal was framed in terms of the Economic Bill of Rights. Now, FDR had proposed, Philip Randolph made it in the 60s, a vision for progressives from labor to civil rights. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, not long before his assassination that spring of 68, he too called for an Economic Bill of Rights. Bernie Sanders in his 2016 and all the more in the 2020 campaign for the presidency proposed an Economic Bill of Rights. Yeah. So our idea was, along with a number of other folks around the country, was not to let the idea die.